Well, good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim. We continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots, the biography of Right Reverend Isaac O. Stringer of the Anglican Church of Canada, with Chapter 11, Part B. In 1924, the means of travel were neither so dignified nor so pleasant. The Bishop and Mrs. Stringer spent a happy weekend at the mission at Fort Yukon with their friends, but when the time came to leave, the weather had become rough and blustering, with howling winds and driving rain. As the day wore on, the storm passed, and soon after midnight they were able to board the launch, Kemeth, which was to take them up the Porcupine. Loading the small vessel had been no mean undertaking, since in addition to his personal luggage, the bishop had nearly a ton of supplies and equipment to be delivered to various missions along the way. On board the vessel were Harry Healy, the captain, Charlie Strom, engineer, the Stringers, and two women from Fort Yukon, Miss Dalziel and Miss Curley, who were going along for a holiday excursion. This was of necessity a leisurely journey, although it was no luxury cruise. Some of the meals were taken on the launch and others on shore. Each evening it was necessary for the travelers to make camp on the riverbank. Fortunately, the weather was fine and warm, and as long as they were protected against the innumerable mosquitoes, they could expect to get some rest before continuing the voyage on empty stomachs at 3 or 3:30 the next morning. Breakfast came later when the craft was tied to a tree at the water's edge and the food prepared and eaten. During the day, the passengers could doze or read, or would from time to time stop to chat with the people in the boats coming downstream, or to call at the occasional Indian camps. 10 days after leaving Dawson, they arrived at Rampart House in the small hours of a Sunday morning. Here they lit fires in the church and mission house, and established themselves as comfortably as they could. For several hours it had been raining heavily. The bishop and Mrs. Stringer greeted the members of the RCMP, Dan Kadzow, the trader and his family, and a number of others, then retired for some rest. When they awoke at noon, the rain had turned to snow, and this in mid-June. In the afternoon, the bishop celebrated Holy Communion and gave an address in Tuktuk. There were 45 people present and 17 communicants. Later in the evening, at a service conducted partly in English and partly in Indian, he baptized 3 infants. These things done, the missionaries continued their way to Old Crow, which took them 18 hours, with stops only for meals. As they arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning, all the inhabitants were asleep, but got up quickly and gave them a hearty welcome. John Tizza, the native catechist, received the visitors and escorted them to the mission house. All were glad to see the bishop, and perhaps happier still to see Mrs. Stringer, who had not been there for 4 years. The bishop, for his part, was glad to see that the new mission house was a well-built, comfortable home, 18 feet by 24, with 3 rooms and a porch for which the Indians had cut most of the logs. During the bishop's visit, the 4-month-old daughter of John Moses and Louisa, his wife, was baptized. Of particular interest was the confirmation of Neil Christopher MacDonald, the son of the late archdeacon. Following the services, there was a community dinner at which Mrs. Stringer gave an orange to each of the 60 persons present. The travelers now continued up the Porcupine River, past the mouth of the Driftwood River, and into the Bell River, until they reached Sinclair Rock, 15 miles below Lapierre's house. This was the head of the navigation for the Kemeth. Farewells were said, and the launch and her passengers turned back, leaving the bishop and Mrs. Stringer to complete the 100-mile journey across the mountains to Fort McPherson on foot. At the confluence of the Bell and Eagle Rivers, there were a number of Indians encamped, who asked the bishop if they might receive their communion, as they had had no such opportunity for a long time, and did not expect that there would be another for some time to come. Preparations were completed, and the service was held. Quote, "A very devout and impressive service," unquote, said the bishop, quote, "in which the Indians sang very sweetly the responses to the commandments," unquote. Going on, the bishop and Mrs. Stringer reached Lapierre's house, which he had not visited since the ill-fated trip in 1909. The place was now deserted, although some of the buildings still stood. They stayed for an hour or so, took some photographs, then returned to their camp at Sinclair Rock. Just below Lapierre's house they saw the mud banks which Archdeacon MacDonald had often mentioned as likely to contain diamonds similar to those found in South Africa. The Archdeacon was not interested in prospecting for himself, but thought that the exploration and investigation would assist in developing the region. Now began the difficult trek over the mountains. Everything necessary, camping equipment, food, and clothing, had to be carried. For this purpose the Stringers hired 3 Indians and their dogs. The Indians would also guide them through the mountains. As they were about to leave, another Indian, William Blindgoose, approached them and begged to be allowed to go along. He wanted to see his family and was far too old to travel alone. The bishop reluctantly refused. They were already short of food, he said, and there simply would not be enough for him to join them. Quote, "In the old days," unquote, said William, quote, "God always provided for us on the trail. Do you think he will fail us now?" Unquote. This seemed unanswerable, so William went. Off they started, and years later Mrs. Stringer described the arduous journey. Quote, "Isaac dressed like an Indian, and I in Norfolk jacket and voluminous tweed bloomers. We had more than 500 pounds of provisions between us and 6 husky dogs. For 3 days we struggled through niggerhead swamps, goose-stepping from one tufted mound to the next, and often slipping into the slime, while the insatiable mosquitoes made our days a torture. There followed 3 days of stiff climbs and descents, and fording rivers and mountain torrents. Sometimes I was so hot I literally steamed as I walked, and sometimes so cold I had to wrap a blanket around me when we stopped to eat. On the 6th day we ran out of meat and potatoes, and were reduced to flour and raisins. We saw a caribou, but it was Sunday, and none of us cared to shoot it on that day. Next day we discovered that feeble old William Blindgoose had left hours before us, taking his rifle. Isaac feared he would die on the trail. Then, in the distance, we saw 2 pillars of smoke. "William got 2 caribou," one of the Indians cried. It was a tough 10-mile trek to William's smoke, but when we reached the site I collapsed from exhaustion. But the caribou's kidneys and steak made the trip worthwhile. William's faith had been vindicated. The Lord had provided. 3 days later we were in Fort McPherson listening to the Indian and Eskimo children singing hymns." Unquote. For Mrs. Stringer, this 9-day trip over the mountains was a notable and outstanding achievement, since no white woman had made the journey before, and she had not only made it, but suffered no ill effects. Having arrived at Fort McPherson, the Indian guides returned to their homes, while the Stringers spent a few days renewing acquaintances with old friends. Then the steamer Distributor arrived, bringing Bishop Lucas, G.E. Merritt, a lay missionary, and his family returning after furlough to Bernard Harbor. W.H.B. Hoare, a former lay missionary and now in the government service, and the Reverend Sidney Coles, a deacon, who was coming to replace the Reverend James Mordaunt Chrysal, and his wife, as they left Fort McPherson. Also among the passengers was a judicial party headed by Judge Dubuck from Edmonton. Within a few hours the vessel was under way once more, this time with the Stringers on board, and at midnight she arrived at Aklavik. This was probably the first time the Stringers had seen the new settlement, which had taken the place of Kittigazik, and the bishop remarked on the picturesque sight as they approached. In the background were the Northern Transportation Company's buildings, the Hudson's Bay Company store, another store, the mission house, and All Saints' Church. Along the water's edge were the Eskimos' schooners, and behind them all the midnight sun among the clouds. During the weekend there were Indians, Eskimos, and whites to be visited, and services to be held in all 3 languages. On Monday, July 7th, Aklavik was the scene of a unique event. This was the trial of an Indian named Ikalukpak on the charge of murder. The trial took place on board the Distributor, and it was for this purpose that His Honor, Judge Lucien Dubuck, had come from Edmonton with lawyers, clerks, and policemen. Ikalukpak, of the Aitaskomek tribe, was charged with having killed another Eskimo, Havogak, at a point 90 miles inland from Three River in November of 1921. McBride, the defense lawyer, claimed that the case was beyond the jurisdiction of the present court, since it was so far from the place of residence of the accused, because there were no Eskimos, his peers, on the jury, and because the accused was not a British subject. The objections were noted but otherwise disregarded, and the trial proceeded. From the evidence, it appeared that the accused and the victim had shared a woman, Katsik, as a common wife. About the beginning of November, the two men had scuffled and fought over a rifle which Katsik had taken from them. Some 9 days later, the two of them went out to a meat cache, taking with them a rifle and a knife. Iklupak came back shortly afterwards and said that Havugak had accidentally shot himself. 3 men went out and found the victim's body about 3 feet from a trap, which he was apparently setting. Together, the 4 of them made their way to Three River to report the matter to the police, but finding them away from home, left word with the post manager of the Hudson's Bay Company. After a preliminary hearing, Iklupak was formally charged with murder. At the trial in Aklavik, he admitted shooting Havugak, but told of the victim's ill will towards him. Once at their camp, he had smiled at Havugak, who had not smiled in return. Bishop Stringer, in giving evidence, explained that if an Eskimo threatened another, the threatened man would fully expect the threat to be carried out. If life was threatened, the threatened man would attempt to take the other's life first, and such a proceeding would be quite in accord with the ethics of the Eskimo. Moreover, continued the bishop, if one Eskimo smiled at another and the smile was not returned, it was a sign that the man who did not smile was very angry and that the life of the other was in danger. After all the witnesses had been heard, the jury retired. They returned after about an hour with a verdict of manslaughter and recommended for leniency on the grounds that the act had been committed in self-defense. Iklupak was then sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment in Stony Mountain Penitentiary. Although this was the first murder trial in Aklavik, there had been 2 others concerning the Western Arctic. The first arose out of the disappearance of 2 Roman Catholic priests, members of the Oblates of St. Mary Immaculate. The 2 men, Father Rouvier and Father Leroux, had been sent on a mission to the, quote, blonde, unquote, Eskimos, and when last heard from in September of 1913, were accompanying them towards the coast. Nothing further was heard from the priests, and in March 1914, Bishop Brainat became anxious, not suspecting foul play, but fearing that they might have met with an accident or succumbed to cold and hunger. He therefore asked for a search party of mounted police. In early 1915, Inspector C.D. Lenoz, a veteran of Arctic police work, was sent from Regina, Saskatchewan to investigate the mystery. Traveling with 2 constables and an Eskimo interpreter named Ilvarnik, Lenoz met some Indians near Fort Norman who said they had heard of the Coppermine Eskimos who were wearing church shirts, and it began to be feared that the missionaries had been murdered. Lenoz continued to Coronation Gulf, where he came upon the camp of the Canadian Arctic Expedition. Also with the expedition was Corporal W.V. Bruce, who was normally stationed at Herschel Island. He had in his possession a number of articles belonging to the 2 priests, which he had found in Eskimo caches, or had purchased in their villages. Among them were a cassock marked R. Pierre Reve, and a crucifix, a rosary, and 2 books, one of them a Latin breviary with Father Leroux's name in it. Further inquiry among the Eskimos elicited the fact that the murders had been committed near a spot known as the Bloody Falls, which had been the location of a massacre of some Eskimos by a band of Indians accompanying Samuel Hearne in 1771. On further information, 2 Eskimos were arrested. Sinisak by Corporal Bruce on May 15th in South Victoria Island, and Ilusuk by Inspector Lenoz on an island in Coronation Gulf on May 23rd. They both admitted the killings, but averred that they had been driven to it in self-defense after the white men had threatened them with their rifles. By the time that other investigations were completed, it was too late to leave the country before winter set in. Lenoz and his companions, with the prisoners, had no alternative but to spend the next few months at Herschel Island. On May 9, 1917, when navigation opened, the party began their journey south and reached Edmonton on August 10th. Shinsinak and Ilusuk were brought to trial 4 days later for the murder of Father Rovere. The Eskimos told how a dispute had arisen in a storm along the trail. The priests, practically out of food and probably thoroughly frightened, had threatened the natives with their rifles. Watching for an opportunity, the 2 Eskimos had then disposed of the white men by stabbing and then shooting them. This done, they cut up the bodies of their victims and ate a small part of the liver of each. This was done according to the Eskimos, so they wouldn't come back. Ilusuk said that he had been warned by his grandfather to take this precaution if he ever killed a white man. There was no doubt at all about the killings, but there was considerable confusion and uncertainty about the motives, and so skillfully did the counsel for the defense plead the case that the jury brought in a verdict of not guilty. The authorities were not satisfied with this result, but popular opinion in Edmonton was so completely in the Eskimos' favor that a further trial for the murder of Father Leroux would most certainly end similarly in an acquittal. The case was therefore transferred to Calgary, and on August 22nd, Sinisik and Ulusik were put on trial for the killing of Leroux. This time it was proved that they had pursued the priests with the intent to kill in order to possess themselves of the white men's possessions, especially their rifles. The sentence of death was pronounced, but with a strong recommendation to clemency. The sentence was commuted to that of life imprisonment to be served at Fort Resolution. The two men were not kept in custody very long, but were released for good behavior and became staunch workers for law and order until Ulusik himself was murdered in 1925. The other murder trial, like that of Iglupak, took place within the Arctic Circle. Judge Lucien Duboc, with Sergeant F.E. Spriggs and two RCMP constables, left Edmonton on June 12, 1923, and arrived at Herschel Island 5 days later. There were 5 prisoners, Ekutuk, Oluspek, and Amotuk, charged with the murder of an Eskimo. Alamak was charged with the murder of a mounted policeman, a Hudson's Bay Company employee, and an Eskimo, and Tataminga charged with Elamukak with the murder of the Eskimo and the killing of another Eskimo. Elakumak and Tataminga were found guilty and sentenced to be hanged. The necessary authority did not arrive in time, and the execution was therefore postponed until February 1st, 1924. On that day at dawn, a little group, including the Reverend W. A. Geddes, assembled in the transport shed of the Herschel Island detachment, where the 2 Eskimos became the first of their race to suffer the white man's judicial murder. It is said that the condemned men, showing typical Eskimo stoicism, quote, were quite composed and gave no trouble whatsoever, unquote. After the trial of Ilupak, the stringers left the distributor and set up a tent ashore. After further visiting and services, including a wedding, they left on a schooner belonging to an Eskimo, Ellen Upik, bound for Shingle Point. 10 miles short of their destination, they met ice and could only work their way to a point 5 miles further on. Here they camped for 4 days, hoping that the ice would open sufficiently to allow them to proceed. Geddes, the missionary at Shingle Point, who had come to Aklavik to meet them, left them in camp and walked back to Shingle Point. He returned with a whaleboat in which they were able to complete the journey, reaching the mission at Shingle Point on July 15th. The bishop expressed his satisfaction that a mission house and church had been built there. The church, erected in 1922, was a substantial log building, and the mission house, also of logs, had 3 rooms and a storeroom downstairs and 2 more rooms above. The visit followed the usual pattern. The missionary party, which included the bishop and Mrs. Stringer, Geddes, and G.E. Merritt and his wife, visited the Hudson's Bay post and all the Eskimos in the vicinity. Inspector and Mrs. Coughlin of the RCMP detachment came to visit them. Services were held and religious instruction given to the Eskimos. In addition, Mrs. Stringer found time to do the cooking and housekeeping for the party. There were 2 unusual services during this visit. On Sunday afternoon, July 20th, the bishop dedicated the church to the honor of St. John. All those in the area were present, making a congregation of 52 persons. 5 days later, he admitted Gabriel Eldon Merritt to the diaconate on behalf of the Bishop of Mackenzie River and for the work among the Eskimos. During the week, the collections amounted to $87.70, and these were given to the fund for the completion of the church. The travelers continued westward after the ordination in hope of visiting Herschel Island. Numerous ice floes and continuing fog made this impossible, and although within 15 miles of the island, they had to turn back to Shingle Point. They were, however, able to visit all the Eskimos along the coast, as well as those at Shingle Point, Nikonut, otherwise known as Whitefish Station. There were a large number of Eskimos gathered for the annual whale hunt. During the 3 weeks that the Stringers spent among the Eskimos on this occasion, they were very warmly received. They were glad to see so many of their pupils of 25 years ago and to note how they had progressed. Garrett Notick, for example, had been a boy in the Herschel Island Day School, which had been maintained by the Stringers. Now he was a catechist, able to conduct services and expound the faith for his own people. On a subsequent visit in 1927, the Stringers were able to reach Herschel Island when the bishop held confirmation and ordination services. At the latter, the candidates were Thomas Umak, one of the first Eskimos to be baptized, and James Harold Webster, a recent graduate of Emmanuel College, Saskatoon. In all too short a time, the visit came to an end, in order that the bishop might reach Ontario in time for the meetings of the General Synod in London. It was necessary for him to return to Aklavik before the distributor left for the south on her last trip of the season. This he did with a few days to spare, and was safely on board when she sailed on August 5th. Bishop and Mrs. Stringer reached Edmonton on August 22nd and made their way east, the bishop to the General Synod, and Mrs. Stringer to the annual meetings of the Dominion Board of the Women's Auxiliary, which that year were being held in Hamilton, Ontario. And just as a side note, the London referred to is not London, England, but rather London, Ontario. And that's the end of Chapter 11. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 12. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God